What is this place? Hello, my name is Javier, Punkomatic's music reviewer, and welcome to the Prime Pro. Today, we're reviewing Hazaman's album called Album. The Night Before is a band by Hazaman that was formed in late 2008 when the three originals, Derek, Damien, and Lee, all studying at the same college, met and formed the band. A year later, in early 2010, Rick Marius joined the trio, thereby completing the classic lineup that we know of today. The band really picked up notice when they got signed onto Punkomatic Records in August of 2012 and soon releasing critically acclaimed albums such as Life's Absence and Fight Back. Last year, they released a new album, brilliantly called Album, onto New Records. This album is the band's callback to their humble beginnings of playing punk rock in garages. But boy, does it stray away from your first picture of punk. The intro song, Serenade, is like a current opening. It begins with passionate chord progressions and ardent melodies. Has everything you would want from a The Night Before song. Dazzling special usage, soothing melodies, dynamic bass work, and gripping drums. Pretty solid opening to this album. At times, the guitars can get a bit too jumpy for their own good, though that doesn't happen with such frequency that it becomes bothersome. The outro manages to send the listener craving off for more, and that's a good thing since there are 7 more tracks to continue, right? Overall, it's a really well done and upbeat opener, though that doesn't quite capture what is to come, but it gently pulls the listener into the album before this next song arrives. Big Shirt for a Big Heart starts off much more solemn than the first track. There are small details in here that I like that go from uses of brief spacing to accidentals, and the emotional build to the song almost pays off when it reaches the outro if it wasn't for the abrupt ending. The bass is a lot busier in this song, and it works for most of the part, though there are times when it sort of muddies up the other guitars. There's a small fade-in section around 140 that doesn't do extremely well to build up the coming section, but it gets the transition job done. Which, speaking of transitions, they aren't all well done in this song, which is weird because The Night Before usually does not have a problem with that at all. However, the intro is great, and the ideas throughout it are good at least. And if for one major problem in this song is that sometimes the sheer variety of ideas don't really connect together perfectly. Well, there are worse problems. It's a bit of an odd follow-up to the opening track. It's the polar opposite of it in a couple of ways. Less packed, emotional-wise, and unfortunately a lot less solid in structure, with song ideas feeling patched together instead of more coherent as a whole. Particularly the transitions start to play for this, especially when the progressions from fades to, well, anything are involved. And it's really weird because, again, The Night Before usually does really good on this. It's a bit of a damper on the album experience so far, but it's not a bad track by any means. There are still a lot of good redeeming qualities. There are some harsh chords in this next tune, and I see where The Night Before was trying to go with it, but it just didn't click with me. The dissonance in it was uncomplimentary to the soulful melodies that follow after. But here's the big problem with this song, and it's that quite often it gets bogged down in its own complexity, and that means that it's quite difficult for the listener to latch onto anything in the song. It's just a bundle of notes that we know are probably brilliant, but don't quite see how. And that's a shame, because it overshadows great moments like at 147 and the fade-ins at 306. But again, it's telling that the most stripped-back moments shine brightest here, while the complex parts leave the listener colder. And now for the next song, Breaking Point. This is the album highlight. The song has a very mellow beginning before exploding into the guitars having a dual melody, shredding with the bass kicked in the high gear and the drums pumping into your ears. Real contrast to the previous song. The intro is exactly what it needs to be, nothing more, nothing less, and the pacing is just so beautifully done, it's astonishing in its own right. 238, by the way, was something else entirely. And it wasn't just that, it was the way that it was placed in the song and how it felt so natural. The epic sound, dark undertones, and ever so subtly more prominent aggression offer a perfect change of pace from the cutesy-ish tunes the listener has been offered up until this point. Which isn't to say the other tracks are bad, of course. The special usage throughout the entire tune is exceptional, while the accidentals and the FX slides are admirable and not used in a cheap way. The more successful blends of style in comparison with the previous tracks, that is also a big plus. And you know, I wouldn't mind listening to a Forever the Night Before collaboration album, but I digress. More album is still to come, and the musical hunger is reawoken thanks to this track. Then the tune has a simple but perfectly effective way to close out. Our favorite track on this album, for sure. Now this next track is a nice one, though rather a safe track. Aside from the respectfully intriguing ska-inspired portion, no real boundaries are being pushed here. It's a bit of a shame considering the tracks that came before did exactly that, regardless of whether they did it successfully or not. Then again, it's perhaps best for the band to tone things down a little bit. Pumping an album full of breaking points will lead to an explosion of several proverbial and literal ovaries. Other body parts too, perhaps. Aside from being another great example of how a song should flow naturally, again, it doesn't really stand out, sadly. It's possibly difficult to follow up a song like Breaking Point, but this seems to be a mid-album lull of sorts. It's a well-placed filler song to help the listener cool things down, though not a particularly impressive or memorable one. Next, now comes for the sixth track on this album, If Love Was Worth Living For. The intro plays around with some interesting time signatures, and 53 seconds in was fantastic. The bass was on top of it this time around, while the guitar shred and sang and the rhythm just kicked this song's ass into gear. The breaks were efficient and the drums was sure to keep things flowing. My personal favorite section on this song was the progression right before the ska riffs kicked in, with the C and M manuals were just lovely. The whole four collaborators thing does make this song suffer at times. 127 does more than anything else to break the mood completely, and it's very obvious when the different collaborators take their turn. As a result, it's not quite perfect, and some people fare better than others. And now for the seventh track off this album, When the Oxygen Runs Out. Welcome to The Night Before's Dark Side. The opening progressions were brooding, and the rhythm was continually catching fire as the intro progressed into the rest of the song. The melodies had a stirring sense of drama to them. Although the dissonance was a little uncomfortable at times, it was quickly resolved. And it's pretty obvious where each collaborators made their mark. But it's no worse for it. And the happier The Night Before standard punk/classic rock sections are balanced by a technical metal side that somehow works alongside of it. I would say that it isn't always the case, and the punk parts sometimes get a little too content with themselves to make sense of the next other sections, but in general this is pulled off way better than expected. The sluggish tempo of the song had at times added onto its theatrical nature, and it was picked up by its quicker counterparts, especially the outro. And what an outro it is. Sure, there are significant contrasts between the light-hearted punky bits and the dark tone metal pieces. Sure, it was very clear when one band leaves off and the other picks up again, but it all flows stupendously, and that ought to be applauded. Definitely another album highlight. Now for the last song of the album, 2 + 2 Makes Punk. Alright, it's an odd way to close up the album, in a sense. When this track sounds its final beautiful notes, the listener is left with a hunger for more musical ingeniousness. Instead, the soundscape remains barren. The ambiguous feeling makes this track feel both a fantastic closing track that some will probably insta-replay, as well as a not-so-fit closer one. But for me, this tune just smells full of punk and feels more like the song that plays at the closing credits of a film or when it's closing time at a bar. A sense of closure is what I get from its classic riffs and its pouring creativity. The special usage, by the way, arguably outshines Serenade, and It closes off album with an optimistic yet melancholy feeling. Having your mood genuinely changed by a song is something that all best closing tracks pull off, and this is no different. Album positioning put aside, it's an amazingly lovable track that boasts some of the best harmonies that we have heard yet to date from not only The Night Before, but from any artist on Punk-O-Matic. After reviewing all of this album's songs, concepts, and averaging our results through a very complicated process that could not be comprehended by the simplest of minds, we give this album a strong 8.9 out of 10. What did you think of this album? Post your thoughts on it, or of our review about it on the commenting space thing somewhere near the broadcast, and thanks for listening. Now, excuse me while I replay this masterpiece.